My name is Anna Petrova. I am 67 years old, and my hands, which once held the weighty, leather-bound volumes of family law, now spend most of their days wiping away tears, buttoning small coats, and cutting the crusts off sandwiches. For 40 years, I was a family law attorney, specializing in the most brutal and heartbreaking corner of the legal world: child custody disputes. My world was one of sworn affidavits, psychological evaluations, and the quiet, devastating testimony of children caught in the crossfire of their parents' wars. I was a good lawyer. I was sharp, meticulous, and I understood that in the courtroom of family law, the most important evidence is often not what is said, but the consistent, documented pattern of behavior over time. I knew how to build a case. I knew how to protect a child. I thought, when I retired, that I had left that world behind me. I did not realize I had simply brought the battlefield home. My own life, for the past 7 years, has been a masterclass in silent, uncompensated sacrifice. When my only son, Michael, married Laura, I had my misgivings, but I held my tongue. Love, I knew, was not a matter of evidence, but of faith. But Laura was a storm, a beautiful, volatile, and deeply unhappy woman who saw the world as a series of injustices perpetrated against her. Michael, my son, a man with a kind heart but a spine made of jelly, was utterly enthralled by her and utterly terrified of her moods. When their children were born, Leo, now 6, and little Maya, 4, the storm became a hurricane. Laura could not cope. The small daily sacrifices of motherhood, the sleepless nights, the endless patience, the constant giving, were, to her, intolerable burdens. The household descended into a state of quiet, chaotic neglect. Michael, a freelance graphic designer whose income was as unpredictable as his wife's temper, was overwhelmed. And so, I stepped in. As a lawyer, I knew the statistics. Children from unstable homes are at risk. I would not let my grandchildren become a statistic. I made them an offer. I told them to move into my home, the large, comfortable house my late husband and I had bought decades ago. "You can save money. Get back on your feet," I'd said. "And I can help with the kids. It makes sense." It was the single greatest mistake of my life. My retirement, the one I had dreamed of, filled with travel, with reading, with quiet cups of tea, vanished. I became, overnight, an unpaid, live-in nanny, housekeeper, and chief financial officer for my son's broken family. My home was no longer my sanctuary. It was a tense, unpredictable war zone, and I was its sole peacekeeper. My pension and savings, which were meant to be for my own comfort, were instead funneled into paying their bills, buying their groceries, and funding Laura's retail therapy sprees, which were her only method of coping with a life she despised. I did it for the children. I told myself this every single day, a mantra against the rising tide of my own resentment. I did it for the look in little Maya's eyes when I read her a bedtime story. I did it for the way Leo's small hand would slip into mine when he was scared. I absorbed Laura's moods, her sudden screaming rages that would erupt over a misplaced toy or a spilled glass of milk. I absorbed the tension, the walking on eggshells, the constant, low-grade fear that permeated the air of my own home. I was the buffer, the shield. I was sacrificing my own peace to give my grandchildren a semblance of it. I thought my sacrifice was noble. I did not understand that to Laura, my presence was not a gift, it was an indictment. Every act of my quiet competence was a judgment on her own spectacular failure as a mother, and for that, she would never, ever forgive me. The abuse was, for a long time, a quiet war of attrition, a campaign of psychological warfare waged with the subtle, cruel weapons of a master manipulator. It was the accidental spilling of a hot cup of coffee on my arm. It was the misplacing of my reading glasses, my keys, my mail. It was the constant, low-murmured stream of insults delivered just out of earshot of Michael, but always in front of the children. "Useless old woman, interfering bitch, living on our charity." I endured it. As a lawyer, I recognized the pattern. It was about power. It was about control. She was trying to break me, to erase me, to establish her dominance in the house that was not hers. My son, when I tried to speak to him, would wave it away. "That's just Laura's way," he'd say, his eyes pleading with me not to rock the boat. "She doesn't mean it." But he was wrong. She meant every word. The final, unforgivable act, the one that shattered the last vestiges of my self-imposed silence, happened on a Tuesday. It was a day like any other, a day of quiet, simmering tension. The catalyst, as is so often the case, was money. Laura had come to me that morning, demanding $200 for a new pair of shoes she had seen online. "It's an emergency," she'd insisted. "All my shoes are out of style." I looked at her closet overflowing with impulse buys, at the stack of unpaid bills on my desk that I was preparing to pay. And for the first time, I said no. "Laura," I said, my voice calm but firm. "The answer is no. We have to pay the electricity bill this week." Her face, which had been arranged in a mask of petulant pleading, transformed. It was like watching a beautiful, sunny day turn into a thunderstorm in the space of a second. Her eyes narrowed. Her fists clenched. "No," she whispered, the word a drop of poison. "You're saying no to me? In this house?" "It is my house, Laura," I reminded her quietly. "And my money, and the answer is no." The storm broke. She began to scream. A torrent of abuse, of insults, of grievances, both real and imagined. She screamed that I was a miser, that I was trying to control her, that I was jealous of her youth and beauty. The children, who had been playing quietly in the living room, ran to my side, their small faces pale with fear. Leo, the older one, wrapped his arms around my legs. I knelt and drew them close, trying to shield them with my body. "It's all right, darlings," I murmured, my heart breaking for them. "Mommy is just having a bad day." My attempt to soothe the children seemed to enrage her further. She saw their seeking comfort from me as the ultimate betrayal. She advanced on us, her face a twisted, ugly mask of pure hatred. Michael was cowering in the doorway of his office, a silent, useless spectator to the carnage. She stopped directly in front of me, so close I could smell the sour scent of her rage. She looked down at me, at her two terrified children clinging to my legs. And then she did it. She gathered the saliva in her mouth, and she spat. Directly in my face. The warm, viscous spittle hit my cheek and dripped down onto my blouse. The shock of it was so absolute, so profound, that for a moment the world seemed to stop. The screaming, the children's fear, my son's cowardice, it all faded into a roaring silence. There was only the feel of her saliva on my skin, a violation so deeply, primally insulting, that it transcended words. And then she spoke the words that would ignite the fire of my final, decisive battle. She looked at me, a helpless old woman on the floor with two small children, and she sneered. "That's what you are," she spat, her voice dripping with contempt. "You're just a dog. A pathetic old dog, begging for scraps in my house. My house. In that moment, something inside me, something I thought had been buried forever beneath years of sacrifice and compromise, broke free. It was the lawyer. It was Anna Petrova, the woman who had fought for the abused and the voiceless, the woman who knew evil when she saw it. And this was evil. This was the abuse of the helpless. Not just me, but the two terrified children clinging to me. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not even wipe the spittle from my cheek. I simply looked at her, and the look in my eyes, the look of a lawyer who has just seen the opposing counsel make a fatal case-losing mistake, made her take a step back. And I made a silent vow. Not to myself, but to my grandchildren. It was a vow sealed by the filth on my face. This was not their home. This was not a safe place. And I would burn it all to the ground to get them out. The game was over. The case was about to be filed. And I knew, with the absolute ice-cold certainty of a legal professional, that I had all the evidence I needed to win. The spittle dripped from my chin onto the faded pattern of my blouse. The children, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, the sudden, terrible silence from me, began to cry, their small, frightened sobs the only sound in the room. Laura, seeing the look on my face, the look of something ancient and powerful awakening, took another involuntary step back. Her rage, having reached its peak, was now morphing into a sullen, defensive uncertainty. Michael remained frozen in the doorway, a useless monument to his own cowardice. In that moment, the grandmother who endured, the mother who forgave, the peacekeeper who absorbed all the poison, ceased to exist. She had been spat upon one too many times. In her place, a different woman rose. It was Anna Petrova, Esquire. And her mind, the mind that had been softened by years of domesticity, sharpened again to the ice-cold, analytical precision of a litigator preparing for war. I did not see a messy, tragic family drama. I saw a clear-cut legal case, Ate prova v. Petrova. And I was the plaintiff, the star witness, and the chief architect of the legal strategy. My mind began to work, not with emotion, but with the cold, clear logic of case law. The first and most critical objective, secure the children. The second objective, remove the threat. The third objective, dismantle the hostile environment. Every action from this point forward would be in service of these three objectives. I calmly stood up. I did not wipe my face. I wanted the evidence to remain for as long as possible. I looked at my son, Michael, and spoke to him for the first time that day, my voice devoid of any warmth, any maternal pleading. It was the voice of a senior partner addressing a failing junior associate. "Michael," I said, my voice cutting through the children's sobs, "take the children to their room, now." My tone, so unfamiliar, so authoritative, shocked him into action. He scurried forward, gathered the crying children, and herded them upstairs, casting a terrified, apologetic look back at me. Now, I was alone with Laura. She stood in the middle of my living room, looking wary, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. The bluster was gone, replaced by a sullen pout. "I'm not apologizing," she muttered. "You deserved it." "I'm not asking for an apology, Laura," I said, my voice still unnervingly calm. "Apologies are irrelevant. We are long past that. I am simply informing you of a change in circumstances." I turned and walked to my small study, the room where I kept my books, my history. She followed me, drawn by a morbid curiosity. I went to a locked filing cabinet in the corner, a cabinet she had always assumed was filled with old tax records. I inserted a key and unlocked it. Inside were not tax records. Inside were 24 identical, meticulously kept legal journals. Each one was labeled with a year. For the past 7 years, since the day they had moved into my house, I had been keeping a log. The lawyer in me, the part that knew the supreme importance of contemporaneous notes, had never truly retired. Every insult, every threat, every act of negligence, every screaming rage, every time she had left the children unattended, every time she had taken my money and returned with expensive things we didn't need while the bills went unpaid, it was all there. Dated, timed, described in the cold, dispassionate, factual language of a legal brief. I had noted when Michael was present and what his reaction, or lack thereof, had been. I had saved receipts. I had printed out her boastful social media posts, showing off new purchases on days she claimed she had no money for groceries. It was a 7-year history of her abuse and his neglect. It was an unimpeachable mountain of evidence. It was her conviction, bound in leatherette. I took out the most recent journal. I opened it to today's date. I picked up a pen, and in front of her, my hand perfectly steady, I wrote, Tuesday, November 14, 11:15 a.m. In response to my refusal to give her $200 for non-essential items, Laura engaged in a verbal tirade, screaming obscenities in front of the minor children, Leo, 6, and Maya, 4. At approximately 11:17 a.m., She spat directly in my face. Witness, Michael Petrova, unresponsive. The children sought comfort from me, at which point Laura referred to me as a pathetic old dog. Note: have not yet washed my face or changed my blouse. Will photograph for the record. Indirect. I closed the journal and placed it back in the cabinet. I turned and looked at her. Her face, as she processed what she had just witnessed, was a mask of dawning, sickening horror. She had thought she was at war with a weak old woman. She had just realized she had been in a 7-year deposition with a master litigator, and she was the star defendant. What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's called evidence, Laura," I said. "It's a record. And the record is now complete." No, my decision was not made in that moment. My decision had been a slow, creeping inevitability, a conclusion building for years. The spitting incident was not the cause. It was merely the final corroborating piece of evidence. The final entry in a long, tragic logbook. My mind was now a courtroom, and the verdict had been reached. The time for documentation was over. The time for action had begun. I needed to act swiftly. In custody cases, especially those involving abuse, the first move is often the decisive one. I needed to file for an emergency temporary restraining order and a temporary custody order, and I needed to do it before she and Michael had time to concoct a new narrative to rally their defenses. But I could not be my own lawyer. It was a matter of ethics and tactics. I needed a proxy, a trusted, aggressive, and brilliant advocate who would act on my instructions without question. My mind immediately went to one person, Julian Croft. He had been my protégé, a brilliant, hungry young lawyer I had hired straight out of law school 20 years ago. I had trained him. I had mentored him. He was now a partner at the most powerful family law firm in the city, and he was known for his ruthless, take-no-prisoners approach in the courtroom. He owed his career to me, and he was the only person I trusted to execute this with the necessary speed and ferocity. I walked past the stunned, silent Laura, went to my desk, and picked up the phone. She watched me, her eyes wide with fear, as I dialed his private cell number. He answered on the second ring. "Anna?" His voice was full of surprise and warmth. "To what do I owe the honor?" "Julian," I said, my voice low and urgent. "I'm calling in a marker. The big one. I'm about to send you a courier with a package. It contains 7 years of journals and supporting documents. It is the complete file for an emergency custody petition. The clients are my grandchildren. The defendants are my son and his wife. The grounds are abuse, negligence, and endangerment. I need a temporary restraining order against the mother, and I need an ex parte temporary custody order, and I need them on a judge's desk by tomorrow morning." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. Julian knew my family situation. He knew of my retirement, of my quiet life. "My God, Anna," he whispered. "What did she do?" I looked over at Laura, who was now pale and shaking. I touched my still unwashed cheek. "She closed the case for me, Julian," I said. "She provided the final, irrefutable piece of evidence. You'll see it in the notes. Just file it, fast and hard." "Consider it done," he said, his voice shifting from surprise to the cold, focused tone of a lawyer going into battle. "I'll clear my calendar. You'll have your hearing by the end of the week." I hung up the phone. I then made a second call, this one to a bonded courier service I had used for decades to transport sensitive legal documents. When I was done, I turned to Laura. The fear in her eyes had been replaced by a desperate, cornered animal bravado. "You're bluffing," she said, her voice a weak imitation of its usual sneer. "You wouldn't do that. You wouldn't tear this family apart." "You are mistaken," I said, my voice as cold and hard as a judge's gavel. "You already tore this family apart. I'm simply cleaning up the mess and protecting the survivors." I walked out of the study and went upstairs to my grandchildren. They were huddled on Leo's bed, their faces tear-stained. I gathered them in my arms. "It's all right now, my loves," I whispered, my voice, for them, suddenly soft again. "Grandma is here." And Grandma's going to fix it. I promise. Nuna. As I held them, I felt no more conflict, no more doubt. I was no longer a mother torn between her son and her grandchildren. I was an officer of the court, and my duty was clear. My home was no longer a war zone. It was about to become a sanctuary, and I would use every ounce of my skill, my knowledge, and my resources to make it so. The case was filed. The trap was sprung. All that was left was the final, devastating judgment. The next 3 days were the quiet before the storm, a period of surreal, tense domesticity that felt like living in the final act of a play. Laura and Michael knew something was coming, but they didn't understand the speed or the scale of the tempest I had unleashed. They alternated between sullen silence and desperate, clumsy attempts at reconciliation. Laura tried to apologize, a muttered, insincere sorry that was more of an accusation than an act of contrition. Michael tried to appeal to me as a mother, his voice full of a wheedling, pathetic pleading. "Mom, don't do this to us," he'd whisper when Laura was out of the room. "We can work this out." I was polite. I was distant. I was a granite wall. I accepted no apologies. I entered into no negotiations. My case was filed. The legal machinery was now in motion, and it was far beyond their power to stop. I spent my time with the children, creating a bubble of calm for them in the midst of the unspoken tension. We baked cookies. We read stories. We worked in the garden. I was gathering them close, preparing them for the transition, while their parents, frantically, blindly, tried to shore up a dam that had already been dynamited at its foundations. The legal papers were served on a Friday afternoon. It was a scene of beautiful, brutalist theater. I made sure the children were upstairs, watching a movie. I was in the living room, reading a book, when the doorbell rang. Laura answered it. Standing on the porch was a grim-faced process server, a man who had clearly seen his share of domestic warfare. "Laura Petrova?" he asked, his voice flat. "Yes," she replied, her voice wary. He handed her a thick sheaf of papers. "You've been served." I watched from my armchair as she took the documents. I saw her eyes scan the first page, the bold, terrifying words, "Emergency motion for temporary custody and temporary restraining order." I watched the color drain from her face, the same look of dawning, sickening horror I had seen when she realized I had been documenting her life. She stumbled back into the living room, the papers trembling in her hand. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice a choked, terrified sound. "What did you do?" Michael came running from his office. He took the papers from her. His legal literacy was higher than hers, and his collapse was faster and more complete. He read the summary of my petition, the litany of dates, of incidents, of abuse and neglect. He saw his own inaction, his own cowardice, laid bare in the cold, precise language of the law. He saw my journals referenced as Exhibit A. He saw the photographs of my bruised arm, the receipts for her lavish spending, the sworn affidavits from a neighbor who had witnessed her screaming at the children in the yard. And he saw the centerpiece of the petition, the detailed forensic description of the spitting incident, an act so vile, so depraved, that it would horrify any family court judge. He sank into a chair, the papers slipping from his grasp. "Oh my God," he breathed. "Oh my God, Mom." The restraining order was the most immediate and brutal blow. It ordered Laura to vacate my house immediately. It ordered her to stay at least 500 feet away from me and from the children until the hearing, which was scheduled for the following Tuesday. "Vacate?" Laura shrieked, snatching the papers back up. "I have to leave. He can't make me leave my own home, my children." "It is not your home, Laura. It is mine," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying the undeniable weight of the deed in my name. "And they are not your children, not for the moment. A judge has just ruled that you are a potential danger to them. Until the hearing, they are in my temporary legal custody." The legal jargon, the words I had used 1,000 times in my career, were now weapons I was wielding in my own living room. And they were devastating. Laura's panic turned to pure, incandescent rage. She turned on Michael. You let her do this. You weak, useless coward. You were supposed to handle her. Their final argument was a thing of terrible, ugly beauty. It was a symphony of recrimination and blame, the sound of a rotten, hollow partnership finally imploding under pressure. All the poison they had directed at me for years, they now turned on each other. As they screamed, I made a quiet phone call. A few minutes later, 2 police officers arrived at the door. I had anticipated this. I knew the serving of a restraining order on a volatile personality like Laura would likely require an enforcement presence. The sight of the uniformed officers in the doorway finally, brutally, silenced them. The reality of the situation, the cold, hard, legal reality, had arrived. This was not a family squabble anymore. This was a matter for the state. The officers were calm, professional, and firm. They explained the terms of the restraining order to Laura. She had 1 hour to pack a bag and leave the premises. If she refused, she would be arrested. The next hour was a blur of frantic, furious activity. Laura ran through the house, throwing clothes into a suitcase, her face a mask of tear-streaked, impotent rage. Michael just sat in his chair, his head in his hands, a broken man. At the end of the hour, the officers escorted a sobbing, cursing Laura to the front door. As she was about to leave, she turned and looked at me one last time, her eyes full of a hatred that was almost pure. "You'll regret this, you old witch," she spat. "I only regret," I said, my voice as cold as a morgue slab, "that I did not do it sooner." She was gone. The front door clicked shut, and a profound, beautiful, and absolute silence descended upon my house. The threat had been removed. The children were safe. The first, and most important, objective had been achieved. I walked to the bottom of the stairs and called up to the children. "Leo? Maya?" I called, my voice soft. "It's safe to come down now. Everything is going to be all right." The hearing on Tuesday was not a battle. It was a rout. It took place in a small, sterile courtroom that smelled of old paper and anxiety, a room where I had spent a significant portion of my professional life. But this time, I was not at the counsel's table. I was sitting in the gallery, a quiet, dignified old woman in a simple navy blue suit. Julian Croft, my protégé, my legal weapon, sat at the plaintiff's table. He was a shark in a tailored suit, and the courtroom was his ocean. Laura and Michael had managed to hire a lawyer, a young, slick, and clearly out of his depth attorney who looked like he had gotten his law degree from a television show. Laura sat beside him, attempting to project an image of a wronged, grieving mother. She wore a modest, high-necked dress, her hair pulled back severely, her face a mask of calculated sorrow. Michael sat behind her, looking like a man on his way to his own execution. He could not look at me. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Eleanor Vance, a coincidence that brought a grim smile to my face, read through my petition, her expression growing more and more severe with each page. She read the summaries of my journals, the litany of abuse, the evidence of financial exploitation. Julian, when it was his turn to speak, was a master of controlled, righteous indignation. He didn't shout, he simply presented the facts, one cold, hard, documented fact after another. Laura's lawyer tried to fight back. He argued that my journals were the biased, unsubstantiated ramblings of a bitter old woman. He tried to paint me as a meddling, controlling mother-in-law who was trying to poison her son's marriage. "Your Honor," he said with a flourish, "this is a simple case of a family squabble, blown out of proportion. There is no evidence, other than this woman's own self-serving diary, of any wrongdoing." Julian waited for him to finish. Then, he stood up. "Your Honor," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying a deadly weight. "My opponent claims there is no evidence. I would, at this time, like to introduce Exhibit B." He walked to the clerk and handed over a small digital audio recorder. "This," he announced to the court, "is a recording of a conversation that took place in my client's home on the morning of Tuesday, November 14th. It was recorded by my client, Miss Petrova, on her personal cell phone." I saw a flash of pure, animal panic in Laura's eyes. She had forgotten about the phones. In her rage, in her supreme arrogance, she had forgotten that in the modern world, everyone is a potential archivist. Julian pressed play. The sound of Laura's screaming, a torrent of high-pitched, venomous obscenities, filled the silent courtroom. It was shocking in its raw, unfiltered hatred. The judge flinched. The court reporter stopped typing, her eyes wide. Michael sank lower in his chair, as if he could will himself to disappear. Then came the sound of my own quiet, firm voice saying, "It is my house, Laura, and my money." And then, the sound that would seal her fate. A wet, sickening, unmistakable sound, followed by my own sharp intake of breath. And finally, Laura's voice, dripping with a contempt so profound it made the air in the courtroom feel cold. "That's what you are. You're just a dog. A pathetic, old dog, begging for scraps in my house." "Oh, I knew." Julian stopped the recording. The silence that followed was absolute. He did not need to say another word. He had presented the ultimate, irrefutable evidence. He had allowed the defendant to convict herself with her own words, her own actions. Laura's lawyer was sputtering, trying to object, but the judge cut him off with a sharp wave of her hand. She looked at Laura, and her eyes were chips of ice. She had spent her career listening to the stories of broken families, of abused children. She knew exactly what she was hearing. The collapse was swift and brutal. The judge did not just grant my petition. She expanded on it. The temporary custody order for Leo and Maya was made indefinite, pending a full psychological evaluation of both Laura and Michael. The restraining order against Laura was upheld and extended. And then, the judge added her own, final, devastating flourish. She ordered a forensic audit of both Laura and Michael's finances, to be overseen by a court-appointed accountant, to investigate my claims of financial exploitation. Michael began to openly weep, his shoulders shaking. Laura just sat there, her face a blank white mask of shock. The world she had built, a world of intimidation and control, had just been dismantled, piece by piece, by the very woman she had considered her weakest, most contemptible victim. The law, she discovered, does not care about your beauty or your rage. It cares only about the evidence. And my evidence was a 7-year-long, meticulously documented masterpiece. I walked out of the courtroom and did not look back. My son, my case, was now in the hands of the court, the system I had served for my entire life. I had done my duty. I had protected the children. The final, and most important, objective had been achieved. The months that followed were a period of quiet, deliberate rebuilding. My house, once a tense and silent war zone, slowly began to transform back into a home. The first thing I did was to completely redecorate the children's room, purging it of the cheap plastic toys Laura had bought on impulse, and replacing them with books, art supplies, and a large, comfortable armchair where we could read together. We filled the house not with shouting, but with the sound of children's laughter, with the smell of baking bread, with the quiet, steady rhythm of a life built on safety and love. The children thrived. It was not an overnight transformation. They were like 2 small rescued plants, slowly uncurling their leaves to the sun after years of living in a dark, toxic environment. There were nightmares. There were moments of fear. But day by day, week by week, I watched them heal. I watched the fear in their eyes be replaced by curiosity, their anxiety replaced by a newfound confidence. They were, I realized, my greatest, most important project. The legal battle ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. Faced with the overwhelming evidence against them, and the prospect of a forensic audit, Laura and Michael surrendered. Laura, stripped of her children and her source of income, agreed to sign away her parental rights in exchange for Michael not pressing charges for financial abuse. She disappeared from our lives, a ghost who had haunted my home for 7 long years. Michael, declared by the court to be a passive enabler, was granted supervised visitation rights twice a month at a neutral location. He never exercised them. The shame, I suppose, was too great. My life found a new purpose. The lawyer in me, the part I thought I had retired, had been reawakened. But I did not return to a downtown law firm. My courtroom was now my kitchen table. My clients were my grandchildren. I became their fiercest, most dedicated advocate. I fought for them to get the best counseling, the best schooling. I used my knowledge of the system not to win cases, but to build a fortress of safety and opportunity around them. One evening, about a year after the court case, I was tucking Maya into bed. She snuggled against me, her small body warm and safe. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice sleepy. "You're not a dog, you're a lion." I felt a wave of love for her so fierce, so powerful, it almost took my breath away. "That's right, my love," I whispered back, kissing her forehead. "And a lion always protects her cubs." My life is not the retirement I had envisioned. It is not filled with travel or quiet leisure. It is filled with school runs, with scraped knees, with bedtime stories, with the beautiful, chaotic, and utterly consuming work of raising two small children. It is harder than any case I ever argued. It is more exhausting than any trial I ever won. And it is, without a doubt, the most important work I have ever done. I was a lawyer who had built a career on protecting the vulnerable. I had forgotten, for a time, that the most vulnerable, most precious clients I would ever have were living under my own roof. I was their shield, their advocate, their last line of defense. The law was my weapon, and my home was my courtroom. And in the final, most important case of my entire life, I did not just win. I saved them. And in doing so, I finally, truly saved myself.